A great nation is not great because it never makes mistakes, but because it dares to place itself under the light of judgment. A great nation is not great because it has never made mistakes, but because from the very first day it dared to publicly declare its values so that history itself could judge it. History usually remembers nations that were born from victory, from uprisings, from battles that redrew the world map. But very rarely does history remember a nation born from a moral commitment. In 1776, when the war with the British Empire was still raging, when the smoke of gunfire had not yet cleared, when the future was completely uncertain, the leaders of the 13 North American colonies did something unusual. They did not merely declare, "We want independence." They also declared, "We have the right to independence, and here is why." It was not a document describing reality, nor was it a declaration of victory. The Declaration of Independence of the United States was written in words far higher than the reality of the moment it was born. It spoke of equality when society was still full of inequality. It spoke of natural rights when millions were still enslaved. It spoke of the consent of the governed when women had no political rights. Native peoples were excluded from the political community, and the right to vote belonged only to a small minority. And those who wrote it knew this very well. Right here, a great paradox appeared. Why would people who had not yet fully realized freedom and justice dare to write standards higher than themselves? Was it naivete? Was it hypocrisy? Or was it a far deeper intellectual choice? This episode does not avoid that contradiction. On the contrary, we will go straight to the heart of it, because it is precisely that contradiction that created the lasting power of the Declaration of Independence, a document not written to close history, but to open a process of self-questioning that would last for generations. The Declaration does not say what America already was. It says what America must become, and it accepts being judged by history if it fails to do so. Victory may create an outcome, but it cannot create meaning. In 1776, the North American colonies were at war. Guns had fired, blood had been shed. The road to separation was almost impossible to turn back from. But victory, if it came, was still not enough to create a nation, because history had shown an uprising can overthrow old power, but it does not automatically create legitimate power. From the perspective of the 18th century world, these colonies could be seen as rebels, as traitors, as a chaotic territory after war. To become a nation, they needed more than guns and bullets. They needed a reason for the people to believe in them, an argument for the world to accept them, a moral foundation so that the new power would not repeat the old path. Victory brings strength, but only values bring legitimacy. And in that context, the Declaration of Independence was born. What is striking is this. It does not begin with a call to war. It does not focus on resentment toward England. It begins with a declaration about human beings, not about America, not about King George, but about universal values that rose above the circumstances of the time. This was a choice that was not at all obvious. Writing higher than reality, a deliberate choice. When the founders wrote, "All men are created equal," they knew very well. Slavery still existed. Women had no political rights. Native peoples were excluded from the political community. The right to vote was strictly limited. If the Declaration had been meant only to describe reality, it would have failed from the very first line. But the Declaration was not written to describe reality. It was written to establish a moral standard for the America that was being formed. From a short-term perspective, the gap between words and reality could be seen as hypocrisy. But from the perspective of nation building, it was a deliberate choice. If they had written only what had already been achieved, the future would have been locked inside the present. If they had written lower than reality, there would have been nothing for society to adjust itself against. So they chose to write higher than themselves. The person who embodied this choice most clearly was Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was not naive. He also did not believe that his generation had lived up to the highest values. But he understood one crucial thing. A nation cannot correct its mistakes if it does not have a standard against which to be compared. By writing down values that society had not yet reached, Jefferson and the founders placed themselves in a position to be judged, not only by the world but by future generations themselves. Natural rights, reversing the logic of power. After raising the question of legitimacy, the Declaration went straight to the core issue. Where does power come from, and why do human beings have the right to resist that power? The answer did not lie in English history, did not lie in colonial tradition, nor did it lie in military victory. It lay in a bold concept, the natural rights of human beings. When the Declaration affirms that human beings are born with rights that cannot be taken away, it was a complete reversal of the traditional logic of power. In the 18th century world, rights came from kings. Law granted rights. The state decided who deserved freedom. The Declaration chose the opposite path. Human beings have rights before there is a state. The state exists only to protect those rights. If the state fails to do that, it loses legitimacy and its reason to exist. Consent, a dangerous principle. The Declaration went one step further. Power is legitimate only when it originates from the consent of the governed. This did not only challenge England, it challenged the entire political order of the world at that time. For centuries, power had been justified by bloodline, divine right, tradition, or strength. The Declaration turned that logic upside down. The people do not exist to serve power. Power exists to serve the people. And if it fails to do so, it loses legitimacy. But the greatest contradiction also appeared right here. If consent is the foundation of legitimacy, then in 1776, whose consent was it coming from? Women had no right to vote. Slaves were not considered citizens. Native peoples were excluded from the political community. The founders knew this contradiction very well, but they did not lock in the concept of the governed. They left it open, not because they had already resolved the contradiction, but because they accepted that the contradiction would exist. Because if it had been locked in from the start, there would have been no moral foundation for society to expand it in the future. A designed contradiction, a moral trap. The founders faced three choices: right lower than reality, safe but locking the future in place; right equal to reality, honest but creating no momentum for change; or right higher than themselves, a dangerous choice because it placed the nation in a position to be judged. They chose the third path. The universal language in the Declaration was not naivete. It was a deliberate moral trap set for America itself. Every later generation could return and ask, have we lived up to what we once declared or not? If the answer was no, then the Declaration had not been nullified. On the contrary, it had begun to work. A moral compass, not a law. The Declaration of Independence is not law. It does not tell you how to go. It tells you where to go. It does not organize power. It sets the standard by which power is measured. That is why it does not become obsolete when circumstances change. In American history, the Declaration has not been worshipped. It has been debated, interpreted, reused in the most critical moments of crisis, whenever society is unjust, whenever power is abused, whenever freedom is narrowed. People return to the Declaration, not to overthrow values, but to demand that the nation live up to those values, from moral commitment to the design of power. The Declaration completed its mission, but it left behind a life-or-death question. How can those values avoid being betrayed once power begins to operate? The answer does not lie in the language of declarations. It lies in the design of a constitution. Values can inspire, but without a protective structure, values cannot protect themselves. And that is when history moved into the next chapter. From Jefferson to Madison. From the language of conscience to the language of design. Conclusion. The Declaration of Independence does not end the story of freedom. It begins that story. It does not build the state. It sets the standard by which the state is measured. A great nation is not great because it never makes mistakes, but because it dares to write down values so that it itself can be judged by history, and dares to design power so that it does not betray those values.